lobby just as I cover off a bit of an intro. That's okay.
Sure.
Thank you. Okay, so good morning, everyone. My name is Mike Tansey from Silver Sands, and welcome to the webinar. Delighted to see so many familiar names, some new names too as well. But for those that haven't been to a webinar before, just want to run you through a little bit of housekeeping. So we kindly ask that you keep your cameras off and microphones on mute. This will help just save a bit of bandwidth. We will be recording the session, so I'll start the recording shortly, and a copy of the recording will be sent out following the webinar. For any questions, please use the chat box and we can answer these as we go. But if you don't get a chance, we will hold some time at the end of the session as well. And finally, I've put a link to the feedback survey in the chat box. I'll send that again at the end. We'd really value your feedback on the session. It's how we improve them and get them better. So it only takes 1 minute to complete. So I'll now reintroduce the session for the purpose of recording and kick off. In fact, there we go. Okay, so good morning, everyone. My name is Mike Tansey from Silver Sands, and welcome to our webinar on innovations with SharePoint and OneDrive. Today, James will be running you through the latest changes in SharePoint and OneDrive with a focus on Viva connections, site templates and page authoring, file and list experience, security compliance, and administration. We'll be running the session as interactive as we can today. We've got some demos and live demo environments and a couple of guidance slides too. So feel free to ask questions as we go. Just before I do, I'll do a very brief introduction to Silver Sands. Okay, so we've been in business for 35 years and we're a professional services organisation specialised in Microsoft consultancy and supports the enterprise market. We focus on the following areas. So at the top, it's in a large circle, Microsoft 365, which comprises of 3 key components. So it's the Office 365 applications like Teams, Exchange, and SharePoint. It's the Windows 10 or Windows 11 for your operating system. And the third component is Enterprise Mobility and Security, EMS, for managing your endpoints and devices. The large circle at the bottom right, we help to deploy, manage and govern both on-prem and cloud infrastructure solutions using Microsoft Azure. And the large circle at the bottom left is for the Power Platform for rapid deployment of business applications, reporting and dashboards. The smaller circles all around the edges are for identity, governance and security, and they're all crucial aspects for a technical implementation to enable a seamless and protected end user experience. And then linking all of those circles together is our support banner. So we offer managed services and proactive Microsoft support contracts. But at the heart of what we do is people and devices. And we think that's the most important part as it embeds the technology through change management and user adoption so it fits within the organization a lot better. And that's Silver Sands in the slide. So I'd like to welcome James Mallalieu, our principal consultant, to kick off the webinar. Over to you, James.
Thanks very much, Mike. Let me just share. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's session. My name is James, and over the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to be talking about the latest innovations in SharePoint and OneDrive. So what I've done is I've selected, handpicked, if you like, the features that I believe have the broadest applicability for most organizations. I'm not going to cover everything that's new in SharePoint and OneDrive, but I think these are the important points. Now, as I go through, I'm quite happy for any questions that you have. If you have a question, put it into the chat. We have left a bit of time at the end of the session, so anything I don't get to, we can pick up then. So I've divided the session into 3 sections. The first section, I'm going to talk about sites, pages, lists and libraries. The second section, I'm going to talk about administration and management. And the final section, I'm going to talk about Viva connections. So let's dive in. First thing I'm going to do is create a new SharePoint site. Nothing particularly new about that, so bear with me while I create a new site. So we're going to create a communications site for this today. And when the site gets created, the first thing you're going to notice is this pop-up. Now, you may well see this in your environment, depending on whether it's been rolled out to your environment yet. But essentially, this is a way of applying templates to your SharePoint sites. And these templates come from two sources. So the first source is they come from Microsoft themselves. And you can see here a set of example templates provided. Now, anyone who's looked at the SharePoint lookbook may well think these are very familiar, and they would be right in thinking that. These have all come from the SharePoint lookbook. The advantage with the templates being available within your SharePoint environment is the site owner can make use of them. So we've got here some examples: crisis management, leadership connection, and these are unique for communication sites. Had I built a SharePoint team site, I would get some slightly different templates. Now, in addition to the templates that Microsoft provide, you as an organization can also submit and publish your own templates. So I'm just going to use the crisis management one, and I'm going to click use template. So effectively what's happening in the background is the building blocks of the template, the Lego bricks, if you like, are being added to my site. So in this case, it's a home page, it's some web parts on the home page. It could be some lists and libraries. It could be some configuration of the navigation. It could be configuration of branding. There's many things that you can do with a template. So here is our template applied to a site. Now, before we explore the template in more detail, I just want to add, this isn't a one-time only process. I can go back and from the site settings menu, I can select apply a template again. Now, the benefit that this provides is you may give your users a series of these building blocks that they can put together in different ways to satisfy a scenario. So I might pick the crisis management template from Microsoft, but then I might have a couple of templates that are unique to my organization that then I can apply to the site. So it's not a one-time only operation. So the template is added web parts, and it's added some navigation to the top and a couple of other bits. So nothing particularly new in terms of the web parts it's added. We've got some news, we've got some events, we've got some feeds coming from Twitter here, we've got integration with Yammer, all pretty standard SharePoint stuff. But let's talk about some of the new features that have recently been rolled out to sites. So the first one I want to do is I'm going to go to this help and support page. And you'll notice at the top of the page, we have an option called Immersive Reader. Now, this is automatically available on every single SharePoint article and news page. And when I go into the Immersive Reader, it allows someone who might need assistive technology to help read the page. So we've got a few options popping up here. We can get the page to audio read to me. We can adjust the contrast of the page, so we might want it high contrast. We can change the font, we can change the text size. We can also use some options to allow us to focus in on particular parts of the text. And that's available, as I said, from every SharePoint page. Now, interestingly, the same technology has also been rolled out and is available within any document library or OneDrive account within SharePoint or OneDrive. So if you've got Word documents that you're managing here, so these Word documents are in my OneDrive, then one of the options that now presents itself under Open is Open in Immersive Reader, and this will give me the same experience for the Word document. Okay, so back to our page. Again, a feature that you might have seen recently in your environment is analytics. This gives us page-by-page analytics on that particular page I'm looking at. So things like page viewers, number of views, average time spent, etc. Often get asked about whether we can get some good usage analysis for SharePoint and whether we can use Google Analytics. And the answer is kind of the usage analytics is okay in SharePoint. This gives a lot of benefit, but it's still not kind of Google Analytics. So the editing experience on the page, a couple of things we're going to do on this page. So if we scroll down the page, you'll notice that we have an FAQ section, quite common in pages, but you notice it's quite long. And if you have, say, 50 or 100 FAQs, this could be quite a lengthy page. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into Edit, and we're going to make use of a new feature, Collapsible Sections. So essentially what this allows us to do is to take a section of content, of which this is a section, click on our Edit Section tool and say, make this section collapsible. Okay, and we can give it a title. I'm just going to give it the same title as is written here. And make it collapsed by default. And I'm going to do the same thing down to the next one, edit the section, make it collapsible, give it a section name. Make it collapsed by default. Now I'm just going to save that before I go any further, and let's have a look at the page now. So we now have a collapsible section, how we're responding to the crisis. And when I open it, it opens a section, kind of does what it says on the tin. Same with here. But what you can see is it substantially reduces the initial screen real estate used when I open the page. So people can focus on the areas of the content that's most important to them. Now, a couple of things about collapsible sections. I scroll down. So in the page that was created, they've added a section with a divider. I can kind of get rid of that now because the collapsible section has an option in it that allows you to include a divider between the sections anyway. So if we go to the section here, do this one, make it collapsible, yes. Show divider, yes, it will automatically add a little divider. And the other thing I kind of like doing is potentially using alternated banding for these sections. So if I just save this, you'll see what I mean. It just improves the readability of the page if you've got quite a few sections. So you can use different colors to distinguish between the collapsible sections. Now, a collapsible section is a SharePoint section, so you can include any content in there. You're not limited in terms of what you can put into these sections. So anything that's available from your list of web parts, you can add into the section. Now, one of the more recent additions to web parts, particularly the text web part, is the ability to insert images in line with the text. So previous to this, if you wanted to add an image, you'd have to add the image outside of the text. So I add a web part for an image, and I select my image. Let's select that. And I've got my image, but I can't put my image within the text, right? So I can't wrap text around the image. I can put it to the left or to the right or to above it, but it's always going to sit outside of the text. What I can now do is use the option here within the text box that says insert an image. So if I use that option, I can now insert an image directly into the text, and if appropriate, have the text wrapping around it. A picture of a llama would be good. Let's take that. So here is the image, and we can decide how it corresponds or fits within the text. So I'm going to say fit it to the right of the text, and I've got some simple tools to adjust it. Now, to show the word wrapping happen here, I need to include a bit more text. So I'm just going to take this text here. There's a line feed, I'm just going to duplicate it. And what you can see is wrapping around the text. And I can move it to that side. Now that's pretty cool. And anyone who's a veteran in SharePoint would say, yeah, it's pretty cool, but SharePoint old school used to be able to do this years ago. Yeah, you're right. It's a recent addition to modern SharePoint pages, but a welcome addition nonetheless. One final point on the page I just want to show is banners across the top. So when you add banners to the top of your pages, you have a couple of different options in respect of how the image is displayed. So you can display no image. You can say display the text above the image. You can have a color block, or you can say overlap. Now, the one that displays the page title over the image is interesting, because actually what is happening in the background is SharePoint is automatically applying what we call a gradient fill to the image to make sure that your text is visible. Now, this is desirable in a lot of cases, because otherwise the text will become kind of merged and mixed up in the background of the image. But it does mean that your image will be slightly adjusted. And this can have implications when someone's crafted a beautiful image that they don't want SharePoint to adjust. So I'm just going to show an example of this. I'm going to pick a different image to my stock images here. And I'm going to pick an image that has a very vibrant background. And I'm just going to adjust the image slightly. Now, I'm hoping that you can see that what SharePoint's effectively done, this gradient fill in, you'll see it in terms of the image getting progressively darker towards the bottom, and that is to allow the text to display. But in this case, I don't want that. I want the vibrancy of my image. So if I click Edit Web Part, new option here is remove the background gradient. Okay, this seems like a minor thing, but I come across quite a few cases where the client has had images specially constructed and they don't want the image to be distorted. So hopefully you can see the difference there. Now, obviously, you need to select your image carefully because the text needs to display in the content of the image. So let's save that page. And that is our new page. Now, a couple of other things for lists and libraries while I'm here. I'm just going to go back to my home page. If we create a new list from the site, this is going to allow us to make use of the new Microsoft Lists capabilities. So hopefully you've come across this before. Microsoft Lists is a new application within 365 that essentially makes use of the list capabilities from within SharePoint, but allows you to create lists both within SharePoint and outside of SharePoint. And they've added quite a lot of new capabilities into lists over the recent months. So what we can see here is when I create a list, I get an option of creating a list from either the templates provided by Microsoft, and these are going to be extended in the next coming months, lists that you as an organization publish, or a list from a site that you've already created. So if it's a list that has branding and views applied to it, you can take that list from somewhere else and recreate it. Now, in this case, I'm just going to create a new list. So I'm going to create a content scheduler. So this is essentially a template that allows you to schedule the production and publication of content. I'm going to call it Content Scheduler. Now, one of the things I can do with this list is I can make a view that displays the content of the list in a calendar form. So I'm going to call this calendar. And just take the defaults. And so this allows me to present the content of my list as a calendar. So I'm just going to add one single entry into here. New entry. I'm going to give it a published date tomorrow. And save that. Okay, so you can see that now appears. Now that's pretty cool. That's been around for a few months, but what is new is the ability to take this view of a list in the calendar form and display it on a SharePoint page. So if I go to my home page, I can edit my page. I'm going to select to add it, say, down here. So I click to add a new web part, select list, select my content scheduler. And what I'm going to do is if I use the little pen here to edit the properties of the web part, I change it to select the new view I've created. I'll just turn off the command bar and the see all option, click apply. And we have the content now displayed as a calendar. So I'll just save that. So that can be really useful when you've got a series of content that you want to display on pages and you want people to be able to view it as a calendar. And that complements the web part that we've got here that allows you to display a series of events as a sequential list, both horizontally or vertically. Okay, so that kind of concludes my first section. That's some of the features that apply to SharePoint sites, to lists and libraries. Hopefully there's something of interest to you in there. What I want to do now is switch gears and talk about SharePoint administration and management. So what I've done here is I've gone into my SharePoint Admin Center. And for anyone that goes in here regularly, you would have seen some of the things I'm going to talk about. But if you don't go in here regularly, I'm just going to highlight some new additions. So the first thing on the homepage is these cards. And these cards show you information about your SharePoint environment at a glance. There are a number of cards that you can add. Some of these will be added by default and some of them that you can add depending on what you're interested in. So if for example, I'm publishing sensitivity labels to my environment, I might publish that because then I get an idea of how they're being used. If I'm tracking OneDrive usage, then I can add that one. Now, a couple of cards that I'm going to draw your attention to that are really, really useful. The Message Center one tells you about changes coming to your tenancy. And this gives you a filtered down view of the 365 Message Center of the items that specifically relate to SharePoint. So if you're really just interested in SharePoint, this is a good place to have a look at. The other two that also I feel are important is the advisory report, service health. So this gives you gives you an indication about any issues with your environment. So I can see there's an advisory currently on SharePoint. I had a look at this before, it's not something serious, but you might want to look at how it could be impacting users within your environment. The one that is probably the critical one is this one, SharePoint storage used. Now, in a demo environment, this really isn't that interesting to me. So it's telling me out of my 1.4 terabytes, I've got 1.38 terabytes available. And it's telling me over the course of 180 days how my usage has grown. Now, in a production environment, this is really important. And whilst down at the bottom, it'll give you an indication of the potential risk, don't take that as the truth of how much of a risk this is to your environment. So what I see quite commonly is people's storage utilization growing, and in some cases growing at an exponential rate. So whilst you might have a terabyte or 5 terabytes left, if you are currently consuming a terabyte per month, then having 1 terabyte left or 5 terabytes left might be an issue. And there are currently 3 common factors that impact your storage utilization in SharePoint, certainly that I've seen. The first one is people migrating content into SharePoint, primarily from file servers, but it could be from SharePoint on-premise. Clearly, you're going to get a spike in the amount of content that's stored in your SharePoint environment. So that's the first one. The second one is the meeting recordings from Microsoft Teams being recorded in SharePoint and OneDrive. So if you recall, a meeting recording, if it's a channel meeting, will be recorded in SharePoint. If it's a meeting recording that's a private meeting, it will be recorded in OneDrive. Now, if you are using a lot of channel meetings and you are recording them, you might see a pretty substantial spike in your storage utilization of SharePoint. However, the key one is retention. So a lot of organizations use the retention features in 365 to retain content in SharePoint. That can be for X number of years, or in some cases, I've seen it forever. That will substantially impact your storage utilization, because essentially, if you say keep all content for 5 years, it's going to do that. So between now and 5 years time, nothing in your environment is going to be deleted. So what I've seen is people's storage utilization spike significantly. And that isn't just a one-off spike, that is a continual trend. And that's where they start to see the issue of running out of space. So this single tile is really important. It may not tell you what the root cause of the problem is, but it will certainly give you insight as to how your storage utilization is going and whether you need to start taking action. So if I now move across into active sites, this gives me a list of all the sites in my environment. Now, I say all sites in your environment. There's one unique exception to here. When you create a private channel in Microsoft Teams, a SharePoint site is created in the background to support that private channel. As of today, those sites are not listed within this view, but there is a feature coming in the future that will allow me to see, for instance, that this SharePoint site has a Microsoft team, and we will be able to see a column that tells you how many private channel sites are associated with this team. Okay, so it'll give you a bit more insight into that. Now, one of the columns that they've added into this view that's super useful is called Created From. And this essentially allows me to see where the SharePoint site was created from. And you might think, well, surely it was created from SharePoint. No. So in most environments, the majority of SharePoint sites now are not created to be SharePoint sites. I know that sounds a bit odd, but they're created to support other services and applications in your environment. So you can see here, this site at the top was created from Yammer. Someone created a Yammer community, and therefore the site here has been created to support the Yammer community. It's possible no one will ever directly visit the SharePoint site. Microsoft 365 groups, if you create a new planner, then it will create a SharePoint site. And obviously, probably the biggest contributor to this is Microsoft Teams. So every time you create a Microsoft team, it creates a SharePoint site. Now, usually, whenever I do an audit of a client's environment, this is what I'm interested in. Because essentially what we found over the last few years is the majority of sites, you see this here, created within the environment, aren't created directly as SharePoint sites. Connected to 365 groups, 48.9%. So this is a demo environment, but we see that the majority of sites created over the last 2 years are almost certainly going to be sites to support the other apps and services in 365. So that's a really useful little indicator of where sites have been created from in your environment. Now, if we go down to settings here, a couple of minor things, quality of life improvements. Your OneDrive settings are now included in the SharePoint settings. So no hunting and going into OneDrive admin, everything's available from within the same place. And the other one I want to highlight is the ability to designate your SharePoint home site without the need to use PowerShell. So not really difficult to do in PowerShell, but it does mean you've got to have the right rights and you've got to understand a little bit about PowerShell. This option now allows me to set or change the designated home site in my environment. Now, for those who haven't come across the concept of a home site, what I would say is a home site is a prerequisite to you thinking about rolling out Viva connections. Okay, so it is something you have to do. It provides some capabilities to the site that you designate as your home site, and it is an important prerequisite as part of deploying Viva connections. But you can now do it from your settings page. Now, a new feature that's been introduced to do with sharing is definitely worth spending a couple of minutes talking about. So you might be aware that there's always been a facility to have expiring links. Now, what do I mean by an expiring link? This is when someone shares a file or a folder, typically from OneDrive, and shares it as an anonymous link, i.e. the link can be used by anyone. And what a lot of organizations do is they apply this policy that says, we want to encourage people to share anonymously, but we don't want those anonymous links to last forever. So this 180-day expiry will ensure that that link automatically expires after 180 days. And that's a really useful policy. But there's been nothing that allows you to control the sharing of SharePoint sites, and having a policy that governs guest users accessing SharePoint sites. So I'm not just talking about a link to a file or a folder, I'm talking about a link to a SharePoint site. And this has now been introduced under this capability. So guest access to a site or OneDrive will expire automatically after this number of days. Now, essentially, with this enabled in my environment, what it means is that when a guest user is added to a SharePoint site, the owner of the SharePoint site has the responsibility to manage and to extend or expire each individual guest who's been provided access to that SharePoint site. So let me show you this in practice. I've got a site here, and in this site, I have invited guest users. Now, if any guest user is about to expire, i.e. my policy was 30 days, so give or take in the next 21 days, as soon as I visit this site, I will be notified by a banner in the header. Now, you won't see this in this environment because I only recently shared the site with my guest users. But the owner will be notified via a banner. They will also be sent an email. And essentially the email will take them to this setting here. So this new setting, guest expiration. And if I click manage, this will list all of the guests who have access to this SharePoint site. And it will give me the option of either extending their access or removing their access. Now, if I do nothing, it will automatically just remove the access. Okay. So the great thing about this is you can allow guest access to SharePoint sites as you currently do. You control it on a site-by-site basis, but you delegate responsibility for managing the life cycle of that guest to the site owner. That's a pretty good feature. And I don't want to confuse this with, if you've come across the Azure AD capability, access reviews, which does something slightly different. This is a specific SharePoint feature, and it targets individual sites in terms of controlling guest access based on a duration of time. Okay, so the last feature I want to mention in this section is hub associations, or hub-to-hub associations. Sounds like a name of a band to me. And I'm going to talk about some basics before I dive into the detail of this. So essentially, when you search in Microsoft 365 or SharePoint, context is key. Where you initiate the search from dictates the results that you are likely to be returned. So let me just quickly explain. If I go to my Office 365 homepage, which I'm here, and I do a search, so if I start typing, the context in terms of the scope of the results is my entire SharePoint environment, all sites, all files, people information, and applications within the 365 suite. So if I start, type Teams, I get to do and so forth, okay? If I go to my SharePoint home site, the context of search is everything within every SharePoint site to people. So if I just type so this is going to return content from everything in my environment, okay, except for those applications. Now, if I go to a hub site, so I've got a hub site here, and for those not familiar, a hub site is a single SharePoint site that connects together other SharePoint sites, okay? And if I do a search within a hub site, the results will return any content from any of those SharePoint sites associated with this hub. So if I did a search for the word retail in this one, it's going to return results from the retail operations SharePoint site that is associated with my global sales hub. And then the final key principle is if I go into a site, retail operations, that is associated with the hub, the search scope is narrowed just to the site I'm currently looking at. Now, if I just go to my slide deck quickly, into just replay to you, and then I'll explain what associated hubs are. So if I'm currently sitting on my my Office 365 homepage, the scope of my search is everything. 365 apps, people, Beaver topics, all of my SharePoint content. If the scope of my search is my SharePoint home site, it's everything excluding 365 apps. If I go to a hub site, my search scope is the hub site and all of the sites associated with that hub. And if I go to one of the associated sites, my search results are scoped to the site I'm currently on. Now, this leads us nicely to associated hubs, because one of the challenges often organizations have, particularly when they have a lot of hubs, is the user doesn't necessarily always understand or have to understand the hubs that sit in the background. And sometimes they're looking for content that might well not be in the hub that they are currently looking at. So what associated hubs allow us to do is take a hub, which is what we've got here, and associate it with another hub, which is what we've got there. Okay, so essentially, when I'm sitting on this site, the hub site, and I do a search, it will aggregate content together from all of the associated sites for the hub I'm on, plus the hub site that's associated and all the sites that are associated with that. Okay, now in practice, if I just go back to my environment,
James, just a question. Sorry, James. There's just a question here from Jason. In what business scenario would you typically have an associated hub?
That's a good question. So in fact, I'll show you the example. So in my case, I have a global sales hub, and the global sales hub pulls together global sales information. But I might have a regional sales hub for, say, North America, EMEA, Asia Pacific. Now, those are separate hubs, okay? But what I want to happen is that when I'm searching the global sales hub, the search spans more than just the global content. It also spans all the regional hubs as well. Another example would be in a, say, an organization that is divided into directorates or service areas. I might have a directorate hub, and then I might have service areas that also have hubs, but I want to be able to search at the directorate level across all of the service areas that relate to that directorate. And the key thing is associated hubs only really impact search. It's quite simply, if you look at the search box, it's going to impact the scope with which the results are returned to me. Now, if I go to set this up, if I go into active sites, and then I go into, say, global marketing. So I click on global marketing, and one of the options I get is hub, edit the hub settings, and in here, this will give me the option to take the global marketing hub, which is this site. So it's the hub site And if this loads, it will allow me to connect it to another hub, a parent hub. So I've got the option here, and I can now say connect it to global sales. Okay, click save. This isn't going to happen immediately, but effectively what would now happen is if I went into global sales and did a search here, it would include the content from that other hub, global marketing, providing I have rights to read it. None of this changes the fact that I need rights to be able to see the content. Okay, so that pretty much concludes my quick tour around the admin and management. So for the last section, I want to talk about Viva Connections. And Viva Connections is one of the 4 modules that Microsoft are releasing as part of the Viva initiatives. I say 4, they've just announced the 5th actually because they've acquired another company. But anyway, for the purpose of this, there's 4 of them. And Viva Connections primarily focuses on taking your existing investment of SharePoint and SharePoint as your intranet platform and adding capabilities into it. Now, if you're interested in a lot of the background and the context and the sort of business proposition, there's plenty of Microsoft content available. So I'm just going to dive in and I'm going to show you the actual features as opposed to give you half an hour's worth of marketing blurb. So Viva Connections essentially provides 4 key features. 3 of those features are primarily SharePoint, and the 4th feature is Microsoft Teams. So let's talk about the SharePoint elements first, and then we'll move in to talk about the Teams element second. So the first feature of Microsoft Viva Connections is SharePoint Global Navigation. Now, actually, this has been around for quite some time. The SharePoint app bar, which you see in the left-hand side of the page, is probably visible in your environments today. You may well have already configured it, and it provides a consistent set of navigation elements that appear across all of the SharePoint sites that you visit. Now, the bit that's relevant for Viva is the global navigation. So essentially what I have here is a series of navigation links that are hierarchical and allow me as an individual to find resources, content, sites, applications, both within and outside of the organization. So, you know, this is sort of general intranet-y type stuff, information about the company, information about what's going on within the company, and find it, you know, common things, policies, procedures, etc. So the global navigation is pretty cool. If I go to Give, this is a different SharePoint site. Previously, I would have lost context, but with the global app bar still there, I can then go to other SharePoint sites in my environment. So I can navigate around. I've got those all available to me. Now, what's interesting about the global nav bar is you can target links. So different people can see different links depending on who they are and their role within the organization. So in my case, you can see here under events, I've got 2 links, an event calendar and a Q&A session with the CEO. But if I contrast this with one of my other users who works within sales and marketing, and we go into what's happening in events, you'll see here I've got 2 additional options. And that's because these have been targeted to me, or this user, sorry, because of the role they perform. And that process is pretty straightforward. If I just go into edit, I can take my navigation down here. And the links, this one, FlySafe Conference, if I click edit, essentially I have targeted it to members of either a Microsoft 365 group or a Azure AD security group. And therefore it will only appear for those people. Now, you must enable a SharePoint home site in your environment to be able to configure this. So hence my point before about it being a prerequisite. So that's global navigation. The next element, the second element of Viva Connections, is the dashboard. So much as the global navigation is kind of useful for providing links, the dashboard has a slightly different focus. The dashboard allows me to present a series of tiles to individuals, and the tiles could be links, but they can also be interactive applications. So you can see in this example, these elements here, this is a link to Microsoft Shifts. This is an element to a product release calendar. This is a link to my benefits site, so it's just a simple link to a SharePoint site. But the one below it is actually a link to my personal planner set of activities. Okay, so these can surface information to me as a user that presents information, presents activities, tasks that I need to perform, and so forth. Now, essentially, it is just a web part that I can put onto the page, and I can put it into different places on the page. So if I want it, for instance, up here, I can add it up here. So it is essentially just a web part, and there's a couple of configuration options. Now, to control and manage the dashboard, if I go up to my site settings, I have an option down here, Viva Connections Preview, which, by the way, will not appear if you don't enable your SharePoint home site. So I go into my Viva Connections Preview, click View Dashboard, and this takes me into the editing experience. So just bear with me because I'm just editing that with a different user. Okay, so let's edit this. Now, when I edit it, I can view it in both desktop or mobile view. You'll see in a minute why that's kind of important. And what I can do is essentially add cards and move existing cards around. Now, at the moment in the preview, the number of cards that you can add is relatively limited. So just for the purpose of this, I'm just going to add a web link, but additional cards are being added and you can develop your own cards. So I've added a card. I'm just going to select the pencil here because I'm going to edit the card. I want to make this a large card. And it's a link, so it can link to something. Now, in my case, this organization is using, let's say, HubSpot. So I've put in a link to the HubSpot website, and you can see it's automatically just pulled over an image and a description. So card title, I'm just going to take that out, put that in, click that. I could change the icon and so forth. I'm not going to encase in this, but I'm going to audience target it. So in this case, I'm going to say this card is only for people in sales and marketing. Okay. Now, before I save it, I'm just going to go to preview. So what preview allows me to do is to see what the cards will look like via the desktop and mobile experience, but just as importantly, see what it looks like to different people, because obviously I want to be able to test it to make sure people in different audiences can see the cards I'm expecting. So I'm happy with that. I'm going to click republish. And if I then go to my homepage, actually, before I do that, apologies, I am just going to edit. I'm just going to move that up slightly so we can definitely see it. So I'm going to go to my homepage, and lo and behold, we don't see it. Why is that? Well, that's because this person is not a member of the sales and marketing team, so they don't see it. Whereas if I go across to my other user, this user, and go to my homepage, give it a quick refresh. Oh, they still don't see it. Interesting. Well, I can't explain that, but there you are. So it should display to this user because they are on the sales and marketing team. But essentially, that's the principle. You can target the cards, different people see different things. So That's the second feature of Viva Connections. The third feature is the Viva Connections feed. Now, SharePoint has always had mechanisms to surface SharePoint content, news content, in a variety of different ways. What's unique about the Viva feed connection is it's not just SharePoint content. So this is showing me content from SharePoint, yes, but also content from Yammer, video content, and in the future there will be additional feeds. So it's bringing together those stories that get published within SharePoint, within Yammer, or video content. And it surfaces content to me and gives me some of the capabilities I would expect to have if I went into those applications. So Yammer, for instance, has the option to add different reactions and comments. So I can see the number of comments and replies to this announcement. If it's SharePoint content, then we only really get the ability to like. Now, this list of stories is personally curated to me. So what another user would see would be slightly different. But there's a couple of mechanisms that Microsoft provided to allow you to influence what stories people see. So one example would be if we take this news story. Sorry, not that news story. If we take this news story, and I want to make sure everyone sees this. So we have this option called Boost. Now, Boost allows you to take a news article and essentially boost it in the feed for a period of time. And if you've got multiple items boosted in the feed, you can control the order of those multiple items. So you can see here I've got 2 items boosted, and what I want to do is put that one at the front. Okay. Now they are going to add additional features in the future that allow you to say boost it for everyone, or boost it until someone's read it, or etc. But for the moment, it's just based on the time. So if I click save, this may take a few minutes to take effect. So I probably won't be able to show you the, it will take a few minutes, but you can see this is a boosted article. So it's shown there. Okay, so that's the news feed. So those are the 3 elements from SharePoint: global nav, the dashboard, and the feed. So how does that relate to Teams? Well, if I flick over into Microsoft Teams, we've all been working, I'm sure, in Teams over the last 18 months. In fact, Teams has become the key application, whether it's on your desktop, whether it's on your mobile device, or something in between. And so essentially, the 4th bit is the ability to take your SharePoint home site and publish it within Teams. So essentially, they provide a Viva Connections app, which is what you can see here. That app is published into Teams, and that essentially allows you to take your home site experience and make it available within Teams. Now, technically, that's not terribly that exciting, but from an end user's point of view, it's very exciting, because if I'm in Teams all the time, I don't want to context switch between Teams and SharePoint. In fact, I don't even have to think about SharePoint. My intranet, call it whatever you want, is available to me directly from within Teams, which is where I tend to be to do my work. Now, you can see here we've got the feed is being displayed and we've got the dashboard being displayed. And if I click on the Viva app, I also have access to my resources, so I can navigate to different parts of my SharePoint environment, or applications or resources outside the SharePoint environment directly from within Teams. Now, the one unique thing is the Teams mobile experience, because clearly a mobile device, particularly a smartphone, doesn't have the screen real estate to support this type of interface. So just quickly, I'm going to show you the Teams mobile experience. It is subtly different. So here is the desktop experience. We have the global nav, we have the feed, we have the dashboard. But if we zoom into the mobile experience, which is here, it is essentially an app link that goes on the footer, and you have these 3 tabbed areas: dashboard, which is the dashboard, feed, which is the feed, and resources is your SharePoint global navigation link. So it is essentially those three elements that I showed you from SharePoint, but it condenses them down into a more serviceable form for a smaller device. Okay. So that is everything that I wanted to cover today. I hope that something of there is of interest to you. If you want to know any additional information about any of what I've covered, please feel free to reach out to me. If you want to see when these things are landing or when they are rolling out, when they're intended to be rolled out, have a look at the Microsoft 365 roadmap and have a look at the message center within your environment. The Microsoft Tech community, particularly the blogs in there, are a fantastic resource to understand about these capabilities. And I think we have a few minutes left for Q&A at the end. So, Mike, just hand back to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, James. That was really good. Particularly like the bits around the Immersive Reader and the ability to kind of boost posts as well as gain some extra traction there. So I can see we've got a few questions coming in, but just before they come in, I'd like to just talk about our 2 upcoming events on the next slide. So we're running a CIO roundtable for hybrid working, and you can gain experience and insight as to what some of the leading CIOs in the country have been doing and how they've adapted to the hybrid working. The CIO from the Royal British Legion, Borough Happold Construction, and Hayes McIntyre Chartered Accountants will be there. So different experiences from different industries. I will post a link to the events. The second event is the Windows 11 and Windows 365 webinar. It's talking about some of the new features in Windows 11 and Microsoft's new desktop as a service offering, so the Windows 365. So very exciting, very new stuff. So I can see we've got a few questions in the chat. I'll post the link. There you go, into the upcoming events and feedback. Any slides as well that you that have been shown will be shared via email after the event. So James, I'll just hand back to you now, and we've had a few questions in there from Claire. So Claire asking around the features we discussed in the first section for the collapsible sections. Do you know when that will be available on all tenants?
So I just laughed, this collapsible sections I talked about nearly a year ago when Microsoft announced it. And just to be clear, Microsoft had a few problems when they rolled it out. And essentially what they did is they stopped the rollout when they'd rolled it out to every target release, what they call target release environment. They have now committed to say this month they will have it general availability across all tenancies. So I can't promise, but they did hit some problems and they stopped the rollout. And the message center that I read, they are now focusing on general availability for this month. So fingers crossed you will get that in your tenancy this month, because I know it's a much requested feature.
Fantastic, thanks, James. And the Viva dashboards and surrounding elements, are they included within E3 or are they E5 licensing?
So everything I've shown today is covered as part of your standard SharePoint license. So Viva Connections, if you are licensed for SharePoint, you are licensed for Viva Connections. So you don't need to buy any additional licensing. That includes the dashboard, that includes the feed, that includes the global navigation, and that includes the Teams app. The other Viva modules have different licensing, but certainly Viva Connections is included as part of your SharePoint license.
Perfect, thank you. A question coming from Richard. So good to see that the home site can be set from admin. Is it still recommended to make the site the tenancy route as a prerequisite?
It's not a prerequisite. So what I believe you're referring to there is this is what's called the root site. It's the site that it sits at the top of your domain. So it'd be yourcompany.sharepoint.com. It is not a prerequisite that your home site has to be your root site. I kind of think it's a nice to have. And if that isn't your home site, then what is the site there? But it's not a prerequisite. Now, if you currently have a site there, which you will have, all of them, all SharePoint environments have a site there that you no longer want to use, you can essentially take the site that's there, you'll see it in your list of active sites, and you can basically use the interface to change it. So I can select the site here. I can use this option. I can't do it in my environment, but replace site will allow you to do it. So it essentially will say, I want to make this site the new root site. So what most people do is they build the home site outside of their root site because their root site may already be an old intranet. They get it all ready, and then there's an option that you can just make it your root site.
Brilliant. Thanks, James. Question coming in from Cliff. So he's guessing not, but can Google Analytics be connected to the home site?
Yes, not out of the box though. So you can essentially develop a component that you can publish into your SharePoint environment that will allow you to track usage through Google Analytics of SharePoint sites. So if that's something you need to do, it's definitely do.
Brilliant. Thank you, James. Another question for Mark. So where would you use the new Microsoft list instead of a list in SharePoint?
So essentially the lists, it's the same thing, right? So the thing that causes confusion is that Microsoft Lists is like an application that makes use of lists in SharePoint, right? So they're not two different things. If I go into Microsoft Lists and I create a new list from here, issue tracker, essentially what it will say is, where do you want to create the list? Do I create it in a SharePoint site or do I create it in my lists? You can take that to mean OneDrive. But essentially it's making use of the SharePoint list technology. They're not two different things. So I like to think of it that Microsoft Lists is just an application, a window, if you like, through to that SharePoint list capability that's already been there. And because they've launched it as a separate app, they've added loads of bells and whistles, you know, the new formatting, the new views, all of that stuff. But it is just essentially a SharePoint list. They are one and the same thing. So if you want a list to be governed in terms of by a SharePoint site that it sits within, then you create it in a SharePoint site. If you want to create what I call a private list, a list just for you to do something, or you and a couple of colleagues, like I'm organizing an event, I'll create a list, an event itinerary list. If I don't have any content apart from what's in the list to store around that, I'll store it in my lists, right? So I store it in, technically it goes into my OneDrive, but it doesn't need a SharePoint site to sit around it, okay? It's just a list that sits on its own, and I can share that site with my colleagues. I can just use it as a list without having the stuff that sits around with the SharePoint site.
Fantastic. Thank you, James. Last question, I think, come through. So where can I find more information about creating site templates?
Okay, I will just do as all good consultants will do, do a search in Google. In fact, I'll do it in Bing. So SharePoint site designs. Which I will just paste that into the chat. You need to do, I'm afraid, it's a bit of PowerShell, and it looks a bit scary, but honestly, it's not as scary as it seems. But yes, you have to do a bit of work with PowerShell, but that's where you go and do it.
Fantastic. I think that wraps it up. I can't see any further questions. If there are any other questions, when you get sent emailed the slides or a link to the slides, do come back. We're happy to take questions after the event. But James, thank you again for that. It's really great. And thank you everyone for attending. We'll speak to you soon.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.